Our next guest is here to take us inside his brand new book, American Muckraker, Rethinking Journalism for the 21st Century, by Project Veritas founder James O'Keefe. It's a how-to manual on undercover citizen journalism, covering themes of power, privacy, and means and ends, and taking history of how the modern corporate media apparatus came to be.
James O'Keefe, thanks for joining us.
Good morning, everyone.
So before we get into your book, I wanted to ask you about your lawsuit against the New York Times. You've had some success with that. Can you tell us what's going on?
Well, Robbie, we sued the New York Times for defamation in March of 2021 after they called our videos in Minnesota deceptive. The New York Times was forced to answer our defamation complaint, which is very rare because you have to get past motion to dismiss. You have to prove actual malice because I'm a public figure. The New York Times admitted in court documents in their answer that they got the facts wrong in that article from September 2020. They said it was not illegal what Liban Mohammed was doing with his ballots, but in the court documents they said it was illegal to harvest more than 3 ballots, and the New York Times has yet to correct the article. So we get attacked for being deceptive and disinformation, but what is it when you admit in court that you got it wrong and still are unable to correct? And that's why this book is about journalism ethics. And in clown world, when they project onto us what they do. And then, of course, after the FBI raid, the New York Times publishes my attorney-client privileged memos and tries to compare it to the Pentagon Papers. So a lot to unpack here, but there's more than meets the eye, Robbie.
And so on the question of journalism ethics, and I think Project Veritas and everybody else is fully within their rights to file defamation claims against the media. There's no defamation right in the First Amendment. You defame somebody, then you have to you really have to defend the claims that you have made. But where I've been critical of Project Veritas on this particular lawsuit is the prior restraint that you sought against the New York Times. And so to give people background, you're in this lawsuit. It appears that so you guys had to turn over documents as a part of discovery. Some of those documents then wound up in the New York Times. The most logical conclusion would be that the lawyers leaked those documents to their reporters, which should be condemned if that's what happened, because you have to respect the sanctity of attorney-client privilege and these lawsuits. All of that aside, seeking prior restraint, telling a journalistic outfit that it can't publish something, to me, is crossing a line that is dangerous, because prior restraint, which means you have this information but you can't publish it, to me really runs up against the First Amendment and really ultimately will be used against organizations in the future like yourself. Are you concerned about the precedent that would set?
Well, well, first of all, it's not prior restraint, it's litigation misconduct. This is a case of first impression, okay? Where we're suing the New York Times for defamation. We get past motion to dismiss. A judge in New York says the New York Times engaged in deception and disinformation by putting an opinion in the first sentence of an article, and then Facebook, Robbie, banned our video because of what the New York Times said. So when you publish the other side's attorney-client privilege documents, this is Ben Barr, the attorney of record in the defamation lawsuit. In American jurisprudence, the attorney-client relationship is sacrosanct. The First Amendment has its limits. It's not absolute. It's not absolute. And the press has a special obligation to oversee itself in a country when they're more powerful than all 3 branches of the government. And you're right. You're right. Defamation is not a First Amendment right. You can't intentionally lie about someone with actual malice. And by the way, where is the indignation from Dean Baquet at the New York Times for the government raiding my home? I mean, I know, Robbie, you're a libertarian. Where is the outrage?
Yeah.
A source sends me
the
a document.
The outrage is over here. Yeah, we're outraged. Yeah, it's.
I mean, but where is the indignation from the Fourth Estate about feds raiding my home and taking my stuff and throwing me against the wall in handcuffs? Within minutes of me being out of handcuffs, guess who texted me? The New York Times. Mike Schmidt, national security reporter. And that's what this book is about. It's about the fact that we live in a world where there's a symbiotic relationship between government, pharmaceutical companies, and the paper of record, and it's not how journalism ought to be. I don't consider it prior restraint, and we could talk a lot about this. It's very nuanced. It's not necessarily prior restraint. A litigant can't publish the other side's lawyer documents, and if someone sent me the New York Times Kurtzberg's documents I wouldn't publish them. And by the way, I didn't publish Ashley Biden's diary. people say you're a right-wing extremist. Well, if I was a right-wing activist, I would have published Ashley Biden's personal diary, but two things. Number one, I couldn't verify with 100% certainty it was hers. And number two, I didn't think public eyes should see the private musings of this person. I couldn't confirm if the things she wrote in the diary actually occurred. So it's a little more nuanced, Ryan, than they make it out to be. And there's a lot to unpack here, which is why I wrote a whole book about journalism ethics.
Well, and you know, the journalism, the mainstream media has really embarrassed itself so badly in the last, I don't even know how many years, forever now, contributing to a loss of trust. And I think it's been a good thing and valuable to have alternative media institutions arise that can shine a light on stories and cover blind spots that the media has developed. Obviously, when you have right now we have a Democratic administration in power, and so there's some softness there, some sympathy from some corners of the media. And yes, there's on the COVID stuff, on other things, there's been this kind of tremendous clamping down or a desire to kind of peddle the preferred narratives in the media from the White House and on tech platforms, as you've noted. So what is you've done this you've paved your own way. What is your thinking about journalism norms and your role in crafting an alternative institution and the responsibilities that you have to shine a light on these stories?
Well, Robbie, there's always been a traditional dichotomy or tension between a journalist's access and a journalist's autonomy. In other words, if you're too adversarial, it engenders biases of their own partisan factions that James Madison talked about. But if you're too close and cozy with your sources in government and pharmaceutical companies, that engenders an even worse bias. It becomes, as Noam Chomsky described, a symbiotic relationship. You take information from sources that are presumed credible, right? And that's what's happening. That's what happened at the New York Times. I mean, Ben Smith, I give Ben Smith, media columnist, a lot of credit. I think he's a hero because he came out on Twitter and said journalists should not be cheerleading these Fed raids against journalists. And there's evidently a schism within the paper of record, the New York Times, because now, by the way, now Ben Smith is leaving the New York Times. That's interesting to me. And you have all these national security reporters, Mike Schmidt, Adam Goldman, writing hit piece after hit piece. In one of these articles, Robbie, the article, this is about our attorney-client privilege documents, which I'm very proud of. I'm very proud of what was in those memos. They all show we're not breaking the law. It said documents show how far deceptive reporting practices could go before running afoul of federal laws. You know another way of saying that? We checked with lawyers to make sure everything we were doing was legal. But do you see how they wrote it? So these reporters tend to word things. It's not so much that they lie, it's that they omit and they use language in a mendacious way. So I think it's important for journalists to use video. We use video at Veritas. There's a whole chapter in this book called Image. I quote Susan Sontag, who wrote a book on photography. Images transfix. Images don't ask you to trust me by virtue of the fact I declare myself credible, like Jacob Bagaj of the Washington Post. Credible journalists say. I don't ask you to trust that I'm credible. I show you the evidence. Last week, we showed you documents from the Defense Department, and you guys debated them. You debated the credibility of the author who wrote them. But they are actual real documents. And I think journalism needs to focus on what David Shaw described, participation journalism, submersion journalism, journalism which is first-person accounts, not anonymous sources, because when you use exclusively anonymous sources, it's the person in the government often manipulating the reporter. So this book, I think it's going to send shockwaves through journalism schools because it reminds people of what journalism used to be in the mid-20th century, which is, it's a far cry from what it used to be.
And I agreed at the time publicly with Ben Smith, both here and on Twitter, that raid was dangerous, that an FBI raid related to Ashley Biden's diary, which if a source provides a journalist with material and the FBI then raids in order to obtain evidence about how and where that came from, that's a deep threat to the First Amendment. But I also wanted to pick up on what you said about sources and access. So let's talk about the 2018 case of the sting or the work that you guys had done with Eric Prince and some others against H.R. McMaster. So as everybody knows, Corey Lewandowski, Steve Bannon, and others, there was a big factional fight going on in the White House. You had H.R. McMaster on one side, and then you had the kind of anti-H.R. McMaster faction, the Bannon Lewandowskis, on the other side. The New York Times had reported that your journalists were trained by Eric Prince in different espionage tactics, and then you orchestrated a scheme where you were going to send a woman in with a video camera to say inappropriate things around H.R. McMaster, and then that would be used against H.R. McMaster. That's what the New York Times reported. That would have been in the interests of that faction inside the White House. Can you respond to that reporting? I think at the time you said it was a giant smear story, but can you respond in some more detail about that entire operation?
Ryan, go back to the article, because the New York Times did not report I was behind the McMaster's thing. The New York Times ultimately said in paragraph like 19 or something, it's unclear whether James O'Keefe was involved. And that's the problem. We weren't involved in that. I wasn't behind that. I came out and condemned. I didn't say I was nothing to do with that. So it's just false. It's all innuendo. It's all supposition, circumstantial evidence. I would swear to it under oath, I would, as would my team, that we had nothing to do with any such idea. And that is the problem with journalism. Again, they always bury the lead. It's unclear whether. To be clear, comma. It always comes down 15 paragraphs below. And why the heck is the national security reporters for the New York Times obsessed with me? They have like a James O'Keefe voodoo doll there at the New York Times. They stick pins in them. They should be sticking pins in the government. What Veritas did do, Robbie and Ryan, is in Washington, D.C. in the summer, we had reporters in bars and restaurants, like reporters tend to do, overhearing and discussing conversations with Stuart Karoff at the State Department, a woman named Allison Raybar at DOJ, and these people bragged openly in public places about how they didn't work and they were scanning license plates of dissidents and they were trying to F things up, to quote Stuart Karoff. These were mid to low level people at these organizations. We're doing our jobs. That's what the fourth estate is supposed to do, expose waste, fraud, and abuse. And for newspapers to attack us for that, I have to wonder whose side they're on. Are they on the side of transparency? You mentioned sources receiving documents. The U.S. Supreme Court, John Paul Stevens authored the majority opinion in Bartnicki v. Vopper from 2001. Journalists have a right to publish documents, even if those documents were stolen, so long as the journalist did not participate in the theft of those documents. This is common sense. Yeah. It's self-evident. Right. I don't know why. Here's a rhetorical question, which I don't think you'll be able to answer. Why is the Washington Post and the New York Times continuously attacking Project Veritas? Right. Please explain to me why they're doing that, and give me actual evidence, not hearsay, not anonymous sources, but actual evidence.
Last question, and we have to run, but maybe Robbie has one more. But can you flesh out a little bit of what that Eric Prince training was? Because it goes to the question of what kind of institution, what kind of undercover work. So what is Eric Prince conveying to Project Veritas operatives?
Well, I talk about that in this book, American Muckraker, in a chapter called Secrets. I learned that espionage and investigative reporting do overlap. It's like a Venn diagram, but we're not spies, because spies may operate for state interest. The investigative reporter operates in the public interest. And Aristotle said you are what you do. So people can cast names and labels, or you're a spy. Well, no, because we operate in the public interest. And yes, we do use undercover techniques, but here, and this is all written about, including your question, in this chapter called Secrets, we believe it's a question of relative deception. If you identify yourself as a reporter to these fraudsters, hello, I'm Ryan Grimm from The Intercept. Tell me all the fraud you're going to be committing. They're never going to tell you that, so you do have to use some element of pretense in order to tell the truth to the audience, and that's what the First Amendment is about. So we only keep 3 secrets at Project Veritas: the names of our whistleblowers, the names of our donors, and ongoing investigations. Everything else is completely transparent, and that's what we do.
Got to leave it there. Great discussion. Thank you for shedding some light on what you're doing, and it sounds like a fascinating book. I actually got a copy. I'm looking forward to reading it. The book is American Muckraker. It's right there. James O'Keefe, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Robbie.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.